Welcome to SpanReads, not your typical rereads podcast, a 17-shard series where we reread the Cosmere and are giant nerds about it. Today, we will be talking about magic system use in Words of Radiance. Joining me is Mish.
Hi, also firstRainbowRose.
David.
Hi, Windrunner here.
And Joshua.
And I'm Jofwu.
And I'm Weiry. And this episode will have spoilers for The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance only. So, what magic stuff happens in this book?
We get gravitation. We play with gravitation a bit for the first time.
Well, Seth was using gravitation quite a bit in Words and Way of Kings, but we do get more of it for sure.
Paladin plays with it for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We don't, we never see Zeth fly with it to the extent that Kaladin takes it in this book, right? We see him flipping gravity around and walking on walls and stuff, but we don't see him fly across the shattered plains to join a battle. You know what I mean?
That's true.
To me, there's something. It's technically the same thing, but there's just something more dramatic about the way what Kaladin does with it.
Mm-hmm.
Kaladin claims the sky.
I should say Zeth does it as well in this book. They're both flying, but in terms of reveals in this book, that's the first time we've seen it used in such an elaborate way, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think it's happening a lot off screen because Seth is getting around that way,
right?
But he just doesn't have, and his blade is a little less efficient. So I think he has to stop a lot more. So it's a little less exciting, but that is true. We definitely didn't. There was an early book sort of distinction made between manipulating gravity and true flight. And I was always curious if there was going to be some true flight that occurred. But I think that, this ended up making sense. Shallan's powers are the ones that always jump to mind for me, though. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Lightweaving in this book is totally new and it's super cool. I enjoy watching her experiment with the powers and try and figure them out. There's all these kind of different limitations that she's sorting through. There's hints of what's more to come with figuring out sound. There is there's just a lot of cool things you can do with Lightweaving. So
I totally agree. And I think it does a good job too. Kaladin's powers are super obviously martially oriented, and Shallan's powers are not only cool, but they go and show that, okay, maybe her Radiant Order might have blades, but they're they're not using their powers to mess people up on the battlefield. They're doing something else with them, which kind of shows the diversity of the Radiance that we're kind of learning about as we go.
And we didn't really talk about any of the interlude characters for this book, but we also see progression in the Ym interlude and the Lift interlude, and also abrasion in the Lift interlude. This book is where we really started fleshing out our understanding of the Knights Radiant as a whole. We learn the names of all of the orders. We learn the names of, I believe, all of the surges in the Ars Arcanum. Pretty sure that happens in this book. Nowadays, there's the double eye of the Almighty chart, sometimes called the Surge Binding chart. And we know what all the symbols mean. We know where all the orders are and the powers they match up to. Before we got this book, we knew where the Windrunners were, and we knew their two abilities. We didn't know which way the abilities went, and so it was kind of a puzzle slotting everything else in, which was very fun. And this book, we got all of the information. We were able to put all of it together.
I feel like that was more Oathbringer. I feel like this one we didn't we had some names, but we didn't really have the powers. That was where I felt like we were really slotting stuff together. But maybe that's me. Because we knew it's kind of always confusing, but because Brandon had explained it to us via WUB before Words of Radiance came out, that that the Radiants share a power with their adjacent orders and whatnot. But I do think this book does a good job starting to lay the groundwork for the somewhat confusing structure of Surge Binding.
I'm pretty sure it was during the Words of Radiance tour, that somebody had put something together and showed it to Brandon. It's yes, you guys have figured it out. We got a lot of readings leading up to Words of Radiance, including the Lift interlude. that was another big piece. So I'm like, I'm pretty sure it was Words of Radiance.
Maybe it was. I personally don't think that we saw enough powers in here to really have put the chart together. But maybe I'm misremembering.
I actually want to say that we did, because I feel like I came into the fandom thinking the chart was mostly known.
Maybe I'm just thinking about like when we finished it, like when we really figured it out. But that's like, to me, that's an Oathbringer memory, not a Words of Radiance one.
Because after Oathbringer, it was kind of like the finer points of like tension. Is Dalinar using tension here? And
I think we had enough puzzle pieces, and knowing that powers were shared, that like we were able to figure out pretty much everything. Like it was like cohesion and tension, where we really didn't know until like Brendan said, like, okay, yeah, you just have those swapped.
I guess we had Yasna too. That's a good point. So we were figuring a lot of it out. It was just kind of that northwest corner of the Radiant chart that's like really hard to like nail down.
That was the fuzzy part.
But that's exciting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. It was back in the day. It's like putting together your surge binding chart of how you thought it all worked together was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. I was very convinced that Kalik was the Deathbringer Herald because he had specifically remarked on the Deathbringers doing a good job. That was a strong connection in my head for a long time. I think the other big magic thing is Shardblades and Spren. Like, that's it.
Explicit confirmation that surge binders have one Spren and not many. Like, there was a theory after Way of Kings that Shallan had many Spren because she saw a lot of simple heads. Like, nope, she has one.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of, for a while people were like, maybe they're just like a guardian of Shadesmar, and like they would let people in. Like, it wasn't even 100% clear to people that was that the cryptics are Radiant Spren in Way of Kings. It was an idea. And I think that the other big thing too was the confirmation that Seth's blade is an honor blade and his powers were drawn from that was pretty big. That was a long, very contentious debate that I was wrong about a lot in this book. I was very convinced he did not have an honor blade.
Yeah. Other fun thing from when the previews were being released and Shallan was like recording Pattern's behavior, people thought that was going to lock him into being the way he was based off of like what we knew about the flame spread from Way of Kings, and like, no, those aren't quite the right measurements. Like, he's going to get smarter. He's not going to remain a puppy dog spren for forever. But yeah, that was, people were concerned during the release of preview chapters.
Oh my gosh, I remember that. That's funny. But yeah, I think that the Shardblades as being spren was was done really well in the book. And I think it works regardless of whether or not you had guessed it or you had suspected it or if you were totally, totally surprised.
Or if you were spoiled.
But I think, yeah, it fits with so many pieces. It fits with with Syl's dislike of the blade. That was a huge, for a lot of time people thought maybe they'd been corrupted by odium in some way. That was the large competing theory with why Syl didn't like the blades. And I think this ultimately works best.
We also get Fabrials that can attract materials that are not described in the Ars Arcanum.
I was going to say that will one day make their way into the Ars Arcanum if Ian gets his way.
Like, why, Brandon? Well, I know why. It's because he keeps forgetting to put them in the Ars Arcanum. I'm like,
but well, now at this point they need to do something else noteworthy for them to make it in. But I think those are cool too because they do a good job of showing what I think Brandon's kind of conception of Stormlight is, which is like a fundamental forces magic system. So attraction and repulsion are very, very straightforward principles. It seemed like the sort of thing that you would postulate as being a thing that Fabrials could do.
I enjoy getting to see the experiments that are happening with the Fabrials, so you can see that the world kind of developing this technology and taking it to new places. So it's not just we're not just kind of dropped into this world and here's a thing that they can do, and here's another thing they can do. We're getting to see them develop the ideas, and so that's kind of fun to be part of.
There's the floating platform relatively early on, but that's the same technology as they use for the tents in the battle at the end. So it's like seeing different applications of like, okay, here's the fundamental principle of like this kind of Fabrial, and it's being expressed in multiple different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's another good encapsulation of the way Brandon likes to write magic systems in like instead of being a person using powers, like, you know, it's more of a technological way where he introduces the idea of SpanReads, which is very immediately intuitive. And then instead of saying, and now I've developed a different thing that does this, he's like, okay, we're going to take that and we're going to build it out into something more elaborate and just continue to up the complexity there. And yeah, those mobile towers were pretty cool. And I like that it didn't like quite work. They were still like, it was like lopsided and they didn't go up as high as they thought it would. Like that was cool. It felt like they were like in the middle of like some sort of engineering test there. Which they were. So
they're trying to figure out all of like the little drawbacks of like the multiplied strain of something in Fusion, the longest chapter title ever.
That was a good chapter title.
We also, Shallan does a little bit of soul casting, and also Jasnah warns her not to soul cast. And then we see some soulcaster ardents who are kind of freaky looking, and are one of whom is turning to stone. Maybe
it's a shame that Jasnah like told Shallan not to mess with it, because it's like I want her to like experiment so bad with that.
Well,
Like,
Pattern backs up Jasnah every time. Every time Shallan goes to soulcast, Pattern's like, I don't know about this. This is not so good.
Yeah,
true.
I know, but that was one of the things that I guess I sort of had hoped for the book that ultimately didn't occur. Was I felt like the promise at the end of Way of Kings was like Jasnah was about to like teach Shallan some soul casting stuff and like teach her about Shadesmar, and we got some Shadesmar knowledge before her untimely disappearance, but we didn't quite get to the soul casting that I was hoping for in the book.
Mhm.
We saw a lot. I feel like we saw less Shadesmar in this book. Like there's a solid Shadesmar scene, like in part 1 with the boat.
Mhm.
But she never really goes back, other than kind of the halfway moment when she's working with the stick.
She peeks in. Kaladin has a point where he sees into Shadesmar,
Which
when
is
he's
cool.
switching gravity for the first time. Yeah, it's like this is the book where we get the info dump on Shadesmar from Jasnah at the very beginning, and we don't see much of Shadesmar at all. We also see it in the prologue, because we see Jasnah's first visit.
Yeah, it's kind of front loaded.
And there's a little thing in Way of Kings. Shallan's chapter icon was of Shadesmar, and in this book, after Jasnah disappears, like her chapter icon changes to Pattern.
I know. I always wondered about that. Like why? Like if they decided they liked Pattern better as Shallan's, and they thought Jasnah would work better with the Shadesmar one, or what was?
I think there's a wow about it, but I don't remember what it says specifically. I do like it. It's kind of a fun little. I don't know. It's a fun little trick to mark a change.
Well, yeah. Well, I think it could be used in really cool ways.
Well, and like Shallan is not the only one whose chapter icon changed. Like because Adolin got his own chapter icon for this book, whereas he didn't in Way of Kings. And Navani. Navani gets her gem Fabrial icon in this book.
Oh, did she?
Yeah, she did. Yeah. Well, maybe they hadn't quite developed like how like the whole chapter icon thing as much. And I know that a lot of the art they were doing was a big ask from Tor.
Yeah, like I can see it's like it being early in the process and not having fully settled. In Jasnah and Shallan's case, I can see Jasnah very domineering presence. So it's like any chapter with Jasnah just gets the Jasnah icon. Like Jasnah disappears. Okay, now Shallan can get her own. Like,
Now Shallan
she's not overshadowed by Jasnah anymore.
That's funny.
I'm trying to think if there's any others that get their own.
I can't remember what they were doing with the interludes yet, because Talon gets his.
Talon gets his, and I believe Lift does hers.
Yeah, and they had the generalized icon for the other interlude chapters.
And of course, Seth has his.
The face palm. Yeah, that's a good one. And in terms of magic stuff, I'm trying to think of other interesting things.
The listeners and their forms is pretty cool. Like we're talking a little bit about that kind of, I guess, from a world building perspective of adding these new race of characters, and their forms are definitely a really interesting thing that is magical. And so it's cool to see that this world that has magic, or at least what we would think as magic, being kind of incorporated into who they are and their identity and how their work, down to their biology, both in kind of more mundane ways, right, with their different normal forms, right? But then you get to storm form, where they're essentially, I don't know if they're toying with surges precisely, or doing some kind of more elaborate magic.
They're embodying their inner Sith Lord. Unlimited power. It's like, where's Eric when we need him?
Yeah. I think the listeners are really cool too, because it kind of like provides like a natural like reason why Fabrial should work a little bit. Like it's like a principle for them to like a jumping off point where they're like, okay, well, we know that effects are created in animals, talking about the animals rather than the listeners at this point. And you can see how they would have been inspired to try something like that, and why that would have been a route their technology went.
Yeah. Actually, I do want to hop back to the Shadesmar info dump at the very beginning.
Okay.
Because Jasna has the line of like, through your hidden senses touching that realm, you make intuitive leaps in logic and you form hopes, blah, 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 blah. Also, like, maybe it might be how you create art, which I'm like, I don't know how accurate that is, or if, like, because that feels more a spiritual realm to me.
Oh, I don't think I agree, actually. I think it seems pretty reasonable to me that this is the realm of the mind. And so that a lot of the things that your mind is doing are being mediated in that realm, and so I think it makes a lot of sense. Like the spiritual realm kind of always feels to be like some sort of like the sort of ineffable parts of someone, like their essence, their soul, and all that stuff. But that's not really where they think. It doesn't seem to me. It informs how they think, in addition to the physical realm. But I've always kind of thought it's the cognitive realm as a midpoint anyway. So
it's fair.
But it's definitely not. If that is an aspect of Shadesmar and Jasna's accurate, it's not something that has been discussed much since.
No, it hasn't.
It's mostly been treated like a place you go to visit.
Yeah, which Jasna calls out in her whole thing. It's like,
yeah,
it's just a different way of viewing reality. And like, it's not a place you can go. And then 2 lines later, it's like, yeah, we'll go and visit someday. I'm like, she calls out herself, and it's wonderful. But like, yeah, that in the fandom, we tend to think of it as a place you can go rather than this is another way of viewing reality. It's like, they're both kind of true, but
yeah. Well, and at the time, we didn't even really know for sure that you physically went into Shadesmar. There were like the scene we see of Jasna and Shallan in Way of Kings. It seems like they were both only there with their eyes closed. Shallan sees Jasna, comes back a moment before Jasna, and sees her just sitting there. And so it wasn't really apparent that they were going to be going physically into Shadesmar.
Any thoughts, Mish, on anything?
Not really. Discussing the magic systems is always a little bit more over my head, and I'm more of the characters girl.
That's fair. Is there anything in the magic stuff that like you really like think back fondly on from this book, or jumps out to you?
I've always loved seeing Shallan playing with the Lightweaving, but I did nothing really. When I think about this book and I think about the magic, or think about the major plot points that stand out to me and stuff, it's usually either her flashbacks or Kaladin's arc.
That's fair. Well, that's a good point, though. I always, in my day-to-day life, I'm thinking about if I had the ability to control gravity, how often I would just be playing with it, as opposed to doing something actually useful.
Well, I love how it plays into Shallan's character, or her at least, especially with her scholarly side and wanting to kind of, I guess, figure it out. And so it's just kind of a cool way to kind of balance like this these new magic ideas with her character, and it just meshes in a really cool way where she's able to experiment with the light weaving in a way that we're getting to learn something, she's getting to learn something, and move the plot forward, and it all just kind of has a lot of synergy.
Mm-hmm. And that reminds me too of, this is the book where Bridgeforth tries to, for the first time, do some sort of standardized testing with Kaladin's powers, which was also pretty interesting. When Sigzil trying to kind of do what Shallan's doing and be like, okay, let's put some numbers on this, which turns out to be just as challenging as one might imagine.
Yeah, quantifying magic. Why would you do such a thing? Like,
don't tell Sigzil that.
More difficult than people think.
Yeah, I always get like a little bit frustrated with that scene because I'm like, come on, guys, like, what did you expect here? We need to like think this through and like do this like scientifically, you know. And they just kind of walk down to the chasm and they're like, I don't know, let's just stick a thing on the wall and see what happens. And I'm like, we should have like thought about this. Sigzil kind of was, but I just feel like nobody else is into it. Like they're like, sure, Sigzil, we can go do some experiments, but then they're like, I don't really want to do that. I don't, you know.
Isn't it
like, we exposed to counting?
It's just like so half-hearted.
Doesn't it end up turning into a fight scene, or is that different? Like I feel like later it's just like they're like, okay, we're gonna fight instead. Never mind. But yeah, I also think Sigzil was like a little out of practice too. Like he kind of got there and he was like, okay, maybe I should have thought about this a little harder before we started doing this. I don't know how charged these spheres are.
Yeah, they didn't have. It's like a fresh thing. It's easy to forget that like Words of Radiance picks up the day after the Battle of the Tower, so like they hit the ground running and like there's a lot going on. So I don't blame them for like thinking like, oh, we just been through this life or death experience where, you know, this was crazy. Now let's go hang out in the chasms and do some experiments on our powers. Like I get it, but
yeah, and I think that it's easy to take for granted kind of like a scientific like perspective, and I don't know how many of them aside from Sigzil have that.
Yeah.
Or like anything like, even just like kind of like a really rigid way of going about doing this and trying to think.
I think that Kaladin, I feel like Kaladin should, because of his just whole like medical background, but he's also a very practical person, and like he's just like, well, and that's why it devolves into a fight, you know, practice fighting.
Medical doesn't do as much of trial and error. Medical is a lot more of, here's the problem, here's the solution. So
true.
He wouldn't really be trained to think about it that way.
Yeah, like, yeah, he wasn't trained to be a medical researcher.
Yeah.
It's just like, here's the things, know them, rather than it's like, here's a new problem, try to fix it.
Like, well, I think, that even like in a more modern education, even he would probably be better informed about the scientific method, but he had a little more of a one track teacher and Lyra in there who was not interested in talking about why soap worked, but more that it was the wisdom of the heralds.
And it's, unless you're an ardent, scientific method is like a feminine thing. It's like women are the engineers and the scientists, and like, why would he know that? It's like, whereas Sigzil is Azish, so it's like more widespread education there.
That's interesting to think about it like a cultural thing. It's true. Sigzil's the best. We should talk about the Shardblade guards just because they're there. That was like a thing that I didn't expect, that there are things that you can put on the sharp edge of Shardblade so that they don't cut, that they can't cut through. It's very useful.
What are they?
But what are they, and why would the Radiants of the past not have just dulled their blades when they fought? I do not know. For a blade that can transform into anything, or not anything, but has a lot of control over its shape.
Do we know that they had them in the past? Is that?
We don't know where they came from. Yeah. It's just they're from the past, but they don't know. I don't think they know when they were created.
I see.
I don't know how something that could be invented without the Radiance.
Yeah, like how something like that could be developed without their knowledge and power. I don't know.
Yeah.
It is an interesting little mystery, though. Something people to keep an eye out.
Yeah. It's going to be a big plot twist in like book.
I want to say there's a word of Brandon where like Brandon just wanted it to be aluminum foil or something. Yeah. And Peter was like, no, that literally can't be. Because like that's not how aluminum works, like physically.
Brandon, you can only push the physical properties of aluminum so far before even normal people start to realize it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's like aluminum guns already pushing it farther than it needs to be. Any final thoughts on magic? I do have one more thing, which is like it's a spiritual realm connection thing, but there's a scene very early on when they're in the caverns and Syl is standing on the edge of a puddle, and it looks like she's on the beach next to the ocean, and her face changes, which is apparently supposed to represent her face now looks like Shallan, which is weird spiritual mumbo jumbo. That how are we supposed to know that, Brandon? Like he mentioned that in A Word of Brandon, acting as if we should have figured that out. I'm like, no, we have no context for that. Like, absolutely not.
I feel like that one didn't surprise me. Like that was something where I had always, Shallan was the only person who'd been on a beach the whole book. So I was like, well, that I didn't think like, oh, it's definitely Shallan, but it reminded me of her when I thought about it. But no, that is an interesting thing. Brandon loves to do little spiritual, like, connections there. I think that my favorite thing about this book's magic is that it's Brandon's first time that he can show the magic developing and show what I think he said is his main, like one of the things he wanted to do with Stormlight, which is magic returning to the world instead of something like Lord of the Rings or a bunch of other fantasy stories where oftentimes magic is drying up and failing.
Yeah. And I don't know if we're going to do final thoughts, but that would be my like big takeaway for this book is because Way of Kings has some magic in it, but it's really pretty downplayed. Kaladin doesn't have his powers until pretty late. You get some magic stuff at the very beginning, but mostly you don't really get a whole lot of magical stuff throughout the book. This one, it comes from the very beginning. It hits with these new powers, and characters are exploring it, and it's just a lot of fun to explore that with them.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing too is that it'd be different if it was magic like emerging, but the fact that it's re-emerging lets them do cool things with magic in the past too, where you've got something like the Oathgate, where you're like, holy crap, how did they build something like this? And you get to wonder where they might go next. And I feel like we didn't talk about the Stormfather being a Radiant spren, but that was huge news. Like that was crazy.
Yeah. There was a whole thing because in Way of Kings, the Stormfather is mentioned as an alternate name for Yezrian.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, so like he's a herald? Like what's going on? And it's like, no, like people are just confused.
I did notice so many times, and this is kind of maybe I something to kind of touch on in Cosmere section next episode, but there's a lot of times where Stormfather emphasizes that he is not just a spren, but he is a splinter of Tanavast, that like a part of Tanavast is now part of him. I forgot how many times that's mentioned, but it comes up several times in this book. So it's just some interesting implications on the nature of Stormfather that I kind of, I don't know, I forgot how emphasized that was in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Except he doesn't use the term splinter to describe himself. He uses sliver.
Which I will again make the case that I think that makes perfect sense. So because if he's got a portion of Tanavast inside of him, Tanavast held the power of the full shard. Tanavast was a sliver. If part of his mind is Tanavast, I think that that's a really easy thing to say.
Yeah. I'm still
as much as you, Ian, about the precise terminology.
So mad. Like I was so mad for so long. It's like at this point, it's like, fine, whatever. But I'm like,
Mish, how many hours of sleep have you lost over this?
We've just got to get you to this stage with Shadesmar Ian, and you'll be good to go.
I had the theory that the Stormfather just straight up was Tanavast's cognitive shadow, which isn't the case. Mm-hmm. But he's still a sliver, apparently. I'm like, okay. I don't think that's explained well, but okay.
Yeah. Well, you never know.
I was also just angry at Brandon's like, oh, the Stormfather doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm like, but you do. Don't use words that mean certain things in a context where it could mean a thing, but it doesn't mean a thing. Like,
for
you
sure.
know what your fandom is like.
Oh, yeah. And he's also said before that, like, being so invested gives you an inherent understanding of romantic theory anyway. So probably should know, even if he doesn't use the same terms, if it's a real thing.
Okay. Ending on an angry note.
Oh, my gosh.
Would a magic session be complete without Ian ranting about terminology?
Probably not.
Terminology is important. Brandon, hire me just to be your terminology person. Like, I will tell you if you're doing something stupid with your terminology. Just like, I'll do it for free. Just let me tell you when you're making bad choices.
Out of the goodness of Ian's heart, he will tell Brandon how not to annoy him.
Thank you for watching. You can find us at 17shard.com for all the news, discussion, theories, and fun that you could ever want. Also rants. You can also get rants here. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud. You can leave us a review on iTunes. You can subscribe on YouTube. And you can also support us on Patreon. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Peace.